Well, Pastor Dalrock writes another interesting article about how him and his wife were watching Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and an old TV show, and one of the lines that was frequently repeated in the show was that he won't give her a divorce even though he knows she doesn't love him anymore. And what a horror show if a man won't give a woman a divorce even if he doesn't love her anymore. And so he says that this line was presented as scathing proof that the man being accused was a horrible monster. Not only was he forcing a woman to remain married to him and she no longer loved him, but he was also preventing her from marrying her latest true love. So he says Hollywood's concerted effort to destroy the moral authority of marriage was clearly successful. No-fault divorce was enacted in California just 8 years after the Alfred Hitchcock series ended, and the rest of the United States followed suit with no-fault divorce everywhere. So he says the simple fact is that the moment you attribute moral value to romantic love, you are creating a rival to biblical sexual morality. In biblical sexual morality, it is marriage that creates a moral space for sex and romantic love. And so we have overturned God's order here and are now claiming that romantic love is the moral space for marriage and sex. Now, probably a lot of people don't even realize that, but I think probably most Christians would say that, and they don't realize the sinisterness of that and how anti-biblical that actually is. He says this is deceptively subtle and at the same time demolishes the moral meaning of marriage. The idea that romantic love confers morality to sex is an idea that goes back to the concept of courtly love, which we've talked about on the channel. We'll talk about it some more, this idea of courtly love and the history there. It says that began around 1100 AD. Courtly love was in part a reaction to the widespread belief among Christians in the Dark Ages that it was unseemly and in fact sinful for a husband and wife to have sexual passion for one another. So courtly love was a pushback against the church teaching things that weren't correct about love. So he says, as St. Jerome argues in one of his books. Now, St. Jerome lived a long time ago, I think in the 400 AD range. So St. Jerome writes, incorrectly, that it is disgraceful to love another man's wife at all, or one's own wife too much. A wise man ought to love his wife with judgment, not with passion. Let a man govern his voluptuous impulses and not rush headlong into intercourse. And then he says, there is nothing blacker than to love a wife as if she were an adulteress. And so Jerome then seems to be saying that passionless duty sex was for marriage, and passion, like passionate sex, was for adultery. And so courtly love is kind of built on this idea with a twist, and it added a new concept of romantic love, separating the emotional aspect of sexual passion. So this newly separated concept of romantic love was worshipped and seen as sanctified. C.S. Lewis sums up the concept of courtly love as the sentiment, of course, is love, but love of a highly specialized sort whose characteristics may be enumerated as humility, courtesy, adultery, and the religion of love. That's how C.S. Lewis sums up courtly love. And I've done a video about C.S. Lewis and courtly love as well. Go back and watch that. But so then a correction kind of came to this idea that the church put out that sexual passion within marriage was bad. So he writes, in the 15 and 1600s, the Puritan movement argued that passionate sex in marriage was not immoral and fought against the idea of sanctified adultery in the form of courtly love. So the Puritans tried to correct this, that sexual passion within marriage was good and courtly love was bad. Pastor Dalrock writes, though, however, some Puritans kept the seemingly innocent idea of romantic love as sanctifying sex. Now that's the problem. In this new twist, romantic love was seen as sanctifying sex within marriage instead of outside of marriage. So courtly love saw sex as sanctifying, or saw romantic love as sanctifying sex outside of marriage. Now the Puritans get some things corrected, but they brought in an idea of romantic love was seen as sanctifying sex within marriage instead of outside of it. So then he points to John Milton, a famous Puritan, who wrote in his book Tetrachordon. John Milton wrote, "When love finds itself utterly unmatched and justly vanishes, nay, rather cannot but vanish, the fleshly act of sex indeed may continue, but not holy, not pure, not beseeming the sacred bond of marriage. Being, if there's, and he says, being at best an animal excretion." So meaning if there's no romantic love within marriage, then sex within marriage is at best an animal excretion. Boy, that is not biblical. Then Pastor Dalrock writes, this, as you'll recall, is the same concept we constantly hear from complementarian preachers. They teach that marital sex requires romantic love to consecrate it. Otherwise, it is merely rubbing body parts together. Now, I just did a video on his article about that. And he says, this idea, though, is not a biblical idea. It is an anti-biblical idea to say that romantic love is what sanctifies sex within marriage. That is not a biblical idea. So Proverbs 5 tells husbands they should be like a rutting buck with their wives. Proverbs 5. And the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that marriage is for life and that not having sex in marriage is a sin. It doesn't matter if there is romantic love, if it's within marriage. Of course, romantic love is nice. That's a good thing. It's nice. But that is not what sanctifies sex. Marriage is what sanctifies sex. So he says, once you invert the relationship between marriage and romantic love, what the Bible teaches as moral becomes sin, and what the Bible teaches as sin becomes moral, meaning sex outside of marriage with romantic love. If romantic love sanctifies marriage and sex, it would be immoral to remain married should the sanctifying romantic love wane. And I think we see that a lot today. So John Milton, who wrote the Tetrachordon, he advocates in his book for no-fault divorce. Now that kind of blew me away, that a Puritan would advocate for no-fault divorce. Milton's divorce tract refers to 4 of his pamphlets: The Doctrine of Discipline of Divorce, The Judgment of Martin Bucer, the Tetrachordon, and Colasterion, written by John Milton. And so they argue for the legitimacy of divorce on grounds of spousal incompatibility. Now that's pretty shocking that the Puritans would be, or a Puritan, probably not largely, but at least John Milton, who's a very well-known Puritan, would argue for divorce on grounds of spousal incompatibility. That is not biblical. The Bible does not teach that at all. But with all that being said, we got to get this turned around. We got to get this marriage thing turned around. We're in the church, especially. I mean, what the world does, that's what the world does. But in the church, boy, we got to get that turned around. But even with all that, we're going to get it turned around because Christ is winning. He is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Until next time, this is the Postmillennial Man.